All right. So are you ready to like really flip the script on how we think about individual performance?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Because you sent over some research that's just seriously fascinating. It goes way beyond, that typical like how to be a better employee stuff. We're talking about connecting performance to things like
Oh, yeah.
socio-technical systems theory, which I'll admit I had to kind of dust off the cobwebs on that one,
Yeah.
but it's so relevant.
Is
And we're even going to get into like the psychology behind pay and reward systems. So
yeah.
today I really want to untangle all these like complex ideas with
Yeah.
you and figure out what truly makes people excel and
Yeah.
what can organizations actually do to support high performance. And hey, maybe we'll even debunk some myths about performance along the way, right?
Hopefully.
I've got you here, our expert, to help us break down this research and get some seriously useful insights. So let's start with, how performance is actually defined. One of the sources defines it as performance is an individual's measurable behavior which is relevant for organizational goals. Okay. Sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah. It sounds simple enough on the surface.
Yeah.
But I think as we dig in, we'll see that it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah. I have a feeling it's a little more complicated than
Right.
just hitting your targets, right?
Absolutely. It's easy to kind of get caught up in thinking about performance as just, hitting your numbers or meeting your goals.
Yeah.
But the research goes way beyond that basic definition.
Okay.
One of the key distinctions that it makes is between task performance and contextual performance.
Okay.
So task performance is essentially that. That technical core of a job, like a production worker who is meeting their output goals. The things that are
Yeah.
kind of easy to measure, right?
You're right.
The stuff you can put on a spreadsheet. But then there's contextual performance, which is all about the behaviors that contribute to a positive and productive work environment.
Mm-hmm.
So this could be like the manager who motivates their team,
Right.
or the colleague who always steps up to help others. Those are things that are often overlooked
Yeah.
aspects of performance, but they are truly crucial.
That's so interesting. Okay, so it's not just about churning out the work. It's also about how you actually contribute to the overall health of the organization.
Exactly.
That's a really cool point. I'm curious, for everyone listening, think about your own job for a second. Where do you feel like you shine the most? Is it in that task-oriented performance? Or in the contextual stuff? What does good performance even mean in your specific role? It's something to think about as we go deeper here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a perfect segue into another key point from the research,
Okay.
which is that individual performance is not a fixed thing.
Okay.
It's dynamic.
Yeah.
It changes over time. There was a study showing how job performance actually improves with experience, which makes sense intuitively.
Yeah.
But it's pretty cool to actually see the data.
Right. Oh my gosh, I totally relate to that. Remember when I was first learning how to insert a specific software or skill related to the host's work? It was rough going, let's just say that.
We've all been there.
My performance was not
The research actually explains this through the
long.
concepts of controlled processing and automatic processing.
Okay.
So when we're learning something new, it takes a lot of conscious effort and attention. That's what they call controlled processing.
Okay.
It's like our brain is working in manual mode. But as we gain expertise, those actions become more automatic. We don't have to think about them as much, which frees up mental bandwidth for bigger challenges.
Right.
So it's like our brains are shifting into automatic.
Like when you first learn to drive, you have to really think about everything.
Yeah.
But now you can kind of do it without thinking. That's a great analogy. Okay. So we've talked about you, the individual performer, and how your performance changes over time. But I'm really interested in this idea you mentioned earlier about socio-technical systems theory.
Yeah.
How does that relate to individual performance? Because it sounds kind of complex.
It is a little complex, but it's super important for understanding how our performance is shaped by the systems around us.
Ow.
So to put it simply, socio-technical systems theory argues that any work environment is made up of both social elements, like people, relationships, and culture, and technical elements, like the tools we use, technology, and processes.
Okay.
And these two elements are intertwined, and their interaction has a huge impact on individual performance.
So you're saying that even the most talented person could struggle if they're stuck in a system that just doesn't support them.
Exactly. One of the sources uses the example of nurses in a hospital and how their individual performance isn't just about their medical skills, but it's also about how well the hospital's technology, communication systems, even the layout of the wards. Support their workflow.
Right.
A poorly designed system can create bottlenecks and communication breakdowns. Unnecessary stress, which ultimately hinders even the most skilled nurse.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, you can be the best nurse in the world, but if the system around you is failing you,
Right.
it's going to be really tough.
That's a powerful example. It makes you think about all these invisible systems that are constantly influencing our performance in both good and bad ways.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking of influences on performance,
Mm-hmm.
we can't ignore motivation, right?
Right.
We talked about how performance isn't just about individual traits, so motivation has to be a huge part of that.
For sure.
There are like a million theories on motivation out there.
Door.
And as someone who's, tried to apply them, it can get overwhelming. So
Yeah.
can we maybe break down a few key takeaways that feel really relevant to what we're talking about today? Absolutely. There are a ton of theories, as you said, but the source material highlighted a few that I think are particularly insightful.
Okay.
One is the job characteristics model,
Okay.
which I'm sure you're familiar with. Basically, it emphasizes how job design impacts motivation. So jobs that are high in things like skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback.
Yeah.
Those types of jobs lead to higher levels of motivation.
Okay. So it's not just about what you're doing,
Right.
but how the work itself is structured.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you give someone like a boring, repetitive task,
Yep.
they're probably not going to be like jumping out of bed to do it.
Exactly. They're not going to be intrinsically motivated to do that work.
Right.
Another theory that I think is super relevant is self-determination theory.
Okay. Yeah.
And this one focuses on our psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Okay.
When those needs are met in the workplace, our intrinsic motivation is much higher,
Okay.
meaning the drive that comes from within. That's where we really see people doing their best work.
So it's not just about motivating people to do something. It's about cultivating an environment where they are motivated from within to do their best work.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. Okay. And of course, when we talk about motivation in the workplace, we have to talk about the big one, money. Does performance-based pay
Yes.
really work?
The age-old question.
Right.
And the research suggests that. It's not a simple yes or no answer.
Okay.
It depends on the type of work. So for routine tasks, things that are clearly defined, performance-based pay can be very effective because it's easy to measure success and tie it directly to rewards.
Okay.
However, for more complex creative work, tying pay directly to performance can actually be counterproductive.
Wow, really?
Yeah,
I would think more money
you would think.
always equals more motivation.
Right.
But it sounds like it can backfire,
It can backfire.
especially in certain situations.
Especially with work that's really complex. It can create a narrow focus on just hitting those metrics
Yeah.
and potentially stifle innovation and long-term thinking.
Wow. That's interesting. Okay, so we've defined performance. We explored its kind of dynamic nature.
Right.
And we even started to uncover how things like job design and motivation can impact how people perform.
For sure.
But there's one more big piece of this puzzle that I'm really curious about. Potential.
Okay.
So we focused on current performance, but what about someone's potential for growth? Can we accurately predict who's going to be a future star performer?
That is where things get really tricky.
Okay.
The research kind of acknowledges that predicting future success is incredibly complex.
Right.
While past performance can be an indicator, it's only really useful if the future role is similar to the current one.
Right.
So someone who excels in sales might not necessarily be a great manager.
That's a good point. Right.
Yeah.
Totally different skill set.
Totally.
And I imagine it gets even harder when you try to predict performance in jobs that don't even exist yet, right?
Oh, yeah. That's a huge challenge.
With technology changing so rapidly, how do you know what skills are going to even be needed in the future?
That's a question a lot of organizations are grappling with.
Right.
And one of the sources raises this very question.
Okay.
How do you assess potential when the goalposts are constantly moving?
Right. It's like trying to predict the weather months in advance. Like, there are just too many variables.
Too many variables.
So how are organizations tackling this challenge? Like, what tools or approaches are they using to try and get a glimpse into someone's future potential?
One approach that's been around for a while, but it's constantly evolving, is the use of assessment centers.
Oh, yeah. Assessment centers. I have some stories about those.
They can be intense,
Yeah, for sure.
but essentially they're designed to simulate real-world work scenarios. to allow organizations to see how candidates think on their feet, solve problems, interact with others.
Okay, so it's kind of like a performance preview
Exactly.
before you even hire someone.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And the source material actually includes this fascinating case study from Daimler Chrysler, which outlines the components of a typical assessment center.
Okay.
They often include things like in-basket exercises, where you have to prioritize and respond to a flood of emails and tasks,
Oh my gosh.
group discussions to simulate team dynamics, and even role-playing exercises, where you might have to, like, handle a difficult client or negotiate a deal.
Wow. Okay. That sounds pretty comprehensive. But are these assessment centers really like the silver bullet for predicting potential?
Well, the research suggests they can be helpful, but there are definitely limitations. Interestingly, some studies have found that general mental ability, which is often measured through IQ tests, might actually be a stronger predictor of future performance than all those fancy situational exercises they use in assessment centers.
Okay. So even with all those simulations, sometimes just a good old-fashioned IQ test can be more telling.
Sometimes, yeah.
That's pretty surprising. But it also makes me think back to what we were talking about earlier with job design and socio-technical systems.
Right.
If the environment plays such a big role in current performance, wouldn't it also impact someone's ability to reach their full potential?
100%.
Yeah.
We can't talk about individual performance without acknowledging the larger context of the organization.
Right.
And that brings us to another element that influences performance: organizational culture.
Culture. Okay. That's sometimes mysterious force. That seems to permeate like every corner of an organization.
Exactly. And the research emphasizes that culture isn't just about slogans on the wall or fancy mission statements.
Okay.
It's about those shared values and norms and unspoken rules that shape how people actually make decisions and behave.
Okay. So it's kind of like the invisible script that's guiding everyone's actions.
It is.
Okay.
And those unspoken rules can have a huge impact on individual performance.
Yeah.
So, for example, a culture that values innovation and risk-taking will encourage employees to think outside the box and experiment.
Right.
But a culture that prioritizes conformity and following the rules might stifle creativity and make people hesitant to propose new ideas.
That makes sense. So the culture can be this powerful force for either enabling or hindering
Yeah,
people's ability to excel.
absolutely.
And that kind of brings up an interesting question for you listening. What's the culture like in your organization? Does it feel supportive of high performance? Or does it create barriers?
That's a great question to reflect on. And it leads perfectly into the next aspect of performance we need to unpack, the idea of well-being.
Yeah.
Well-being. I think it's something that a lot of people are talking about these days.
It is, and for good reason. Like, can we really expect people to perform at their best if they're, like, stressed out, burnout, or just generally unhappy?
That's a great question, and one that I think more and more organizations are starting to ask themselves.
Yeah.
Because the research is pretty clear that chronic stress leads to burnout, decreased productivity, and a whole host of negative health outcomes.
Yeah, burnout's something that I think a lot of people listening can probably relate to. It feels like it's become an epidemic.
It has. Yeah. And the research suggests that organizations have a pretty big role to play in either mitigating or exacerbating
That's
stress.
So what can organizations actually do to create like a more supportive and less stressful environment? Is it all about like beanbag chairs and ping pong tables?
Well, those perks can be nice,
Mhm.
but they're not really the core solution.
Okay.
One of the sources I thought really emphasized the importance of job design.
Yeah. Okay.
Jobs that are high in demand but low in control, those are a recipe for stress and burnout.
Right.
It's that feeling of being constantly asked to do more with less, without having the autonomy to make decisions or
Yeah.
influence how the work gets done.
Yeah, it's like that classic feeling of being overwhelmed and powerless at the same time.
Exactly.
Right.
And it kind of echoes what we talked about earlier with the job characteristics model.
Yeah.
You know, people need a sense of autonomy and control over their work
Yeah.
to feel motivated and engaged.
Right. It makes sense. And beyond job design,
Yeah.
it's also about creating a culture that prioritizes well-being. Okay, so what does a well-being culture actually look like? Is it just about offering like yoga classes and meditation apps?
Those things can be helpful,
Yeah.
but it runs a lot deeper than that.
Okay.
It's about things like promoting work-life balance, offering flexible work arrangements, providing access to mental health resources, and creating a psychologically safe environment where people feel comfortable speaking up about their concerns without fear of judgment or retaliation.
So it's about treating employees like human beings.
Yeah.
with lives outside of work, not just, machines churning out productivity.
Exactly.
Right.
And recognizing that when people feel supported and valued, they're more likely to be engaged, productive,
Yeah.
and resilient in the face of challenges.
That makes sense. But let's be real. Not every organization is going to buy into this whole well-being thing.
Right.
Right. Some might just see it as like a nice to have, but not essential to the bottom line.
That's true. There's definitely still a spectrum out there. In terms of, awareness and commitment, when it comes to well-being in the workplace, but I think the tide is turning. We're seeing more and more research highlighting the link between well-being and performance.
Yeah.
And as organizations are facing increasing competition for talent, they're realizing that well-being isn't just about being nice. It's actually a strategic advantage.
So it's not just about doing the right thing. It's about doing the smart thing for the business.
Exactly.
As well.
It can lead to higher engagement, lower turnover, reduced healthcare costs, ultimately a healthier bottom line.
So you're saying it's a win-win?
It is.
Okay, I'm convinced. But how do we actually measure well-being? And how do we even know if our efforts are actually making a difference?
That's a key question. One of the sources I thought emphasized that well-being is a multidimensional concept.
Okay.
It's not just about physical health. It's about mental, emotional, and social well-being.
So it's about, like, feeling good in all aspects of your life, not just being free from illness.
Exactly. And there are a bunch of different ways to measure it. Organizations can use surveys, interviews, focus groups, even biometric data to gather insights into employee well-being.
So you're saying take a holistic approach.
Holistic and data-driven.
Yeah. Use a mix of methods to really understand what's going on.
Totally.
With your people.
And the key is to use that data to then create targeted interventions and programs that address the specific needs of your workforce.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're seeing in the data that your employees are struggling with work-life balance, you might introduce more flexible work arrangements or offer workshops on time management and stress reduction.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about how important it is to create a work environment that supports well-being. But I'm also curious, what about the role of individual responsibility? Like, what can people do on their own to cultivate well-being, even if their organization isn't perfect?
That's such an important point. While organizations definitely have a responsibility to create supportive environments, individuals also have a role to play. And one of the sources actually talks about this concept of psychological capital,
Okay.
which refers to an individual's positive psychological resources.
Okay, what are these psychological resources?
They include things like self-efficacy, which is essentially your belief in your ability to succeed,
Okay.
optimism, hope, and resilience.
So it's like cultivating a positive mindset
Right.
and a belief in your own ability to navigate challenges.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the research shows that people with high levels of this psychological capital are better equipped to handle stress, bounce back from setbacks, and ultimately achieve their goals.
So how can someone actually build their psychological capital? Is this something you're born with, or is it something you can develop?
The good news is that it can be developed.
Okay, good.
There are all sorts of different techniques and practices that individuals can use, like mindfulness, gratitude exercises, even things like cognitive behavioral therapy, to strengthen their psychological resources.
So it's like building a mental gym for your mind.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
They're just as important as physical exercise
Right.
for maintaining your overall well-being.
You know, one of the things that's really striking me as we're talking about all this is how interconnected everything is. Like, we've gone from defining performance to the role of the environment and culture, and now we're talking about well-being and even individual mindset. It's
Yeah.
like all these pieces are part of this larger puzzle.
You're absolutely right. And actually, one of the sources touches on this idea of interconnectedness when they talk about the concept of flow.
Okay, flow state. I love that feeling. It's like that feeling of being completely absorbed in what you're doing, where time kind of flies by and you're performing at your peak.
Exactly. And the research suggests that flow is more likely to occur when there's a good fit between an individual's skills and the challenges of their work,
Okay.
when they have a clear sense of purpose and goals, and when they feel a sense of control and autonomy over their actions.
So it's not just about being in the zone. It's about creating the conditions for flow to occur.
Exactly. And that's where all of these pieces that we've been discussing kind of come together. You know, job design, organizational culture, well-being, individual mindset. They all contribute to creating that environment for optimal performance and flow.
Okay, so it's not just about individual effort or talent. It's about aligning all these different factors to create, like the ideal conditions for success.
It's about creating a system
Yeah,
that supports and amplifies individual potential.
I love that. One of the sources mentioned this concept, and I think ties in perfectly with this idea of creating that supportive system, resonant leadership.
Ah, yeah.
What is that?
Resonant leadership. It's this fascinating approach that emphasizes the importance of emotional intelligence and creating a positive emotional climate within teams and organizations.
So it's about leaders being more in tune with their own emotions and the emotions of those around them.
Exactly.
Right.
Resonant leaders are skilled at recognizing and managing their own emotions, as well as understanding and empathizing with the emotions of others.
So it's not just about being like tough
Mm-hmm.
or decisive. It's about being aware of all the emotional undercurrents. That can impact performance.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the research shows that these resonant leaders are more effective at building trust, inspiring motivation, and fostering collaboration. They create environments where people feel safe to take risks, share their ideas, and just be their authentic selves.
Makes sense. People are going to thrive in those environments.
Where they feel supported, professionally and emotionally.
Right.
Right. I have to say this deep dive has really challenged my thinking about performance. It's so much more complex and nuanced than I think I initially realized. But in a way, it's also empowering because it means that performance isn't just some predetermined outcome. It's something we can influence and shape by understanding all these different factors.
I agree. And one of the things that I find most exciting about all this research is this growing body of research on how to develop and enhance these factors, both at the individual and organizational level.
Right. It's not just about identifying the problem. It's about finding solutions. Exactly.
Okay.
And the research is giving us all these insights and practical strategies for things like designing more engaging jobs, building those causative cultures, promoting well-being, developing resonant leadership.
Now, speaking of practical strategies, one of the sources really dives deep into the topic of training and development.
Yep.
Which I think we often take for granted. But training plays a huge role in enhancing performance. So what are some key takeaways from the research on how to make training more effective?
One of the things that really stuck out to me was the emphasis on active learning.
Okay.
You know those traditional training methods, like lectures and presentations? They're becoming less effective, especially when it comes to developing the complex skills that are needed in today's workplace.
But ditch the PowerPoint and get people more involved?
Pretty much.
Okay.
The research suggests that the training methods that encourage things like active participation, experimentation, learning from mistakes, those are much more effective for developing skills that can be transferred to real-world situations.
Right. It's like the difference between reading about riding a bike and actually getting on a bike.
Exactly.
And maybe falling a few times.
Exactly.
You learn by doing.
Yeah. And this ties back to that concept of adaptive expertise that we were talking about earlier. Training needs to move beyond just rote memorization and focus on developing those flexible, adaptable skills that can be applied to a wide range of situations.
So it's not just about teaching people what to do, but teaching them how to think and adapt.
That's the essence of it.
Okay.
And another really important point the research highlights is the importance of the post-training environment.
Okay.
Even the best training program in the world will fall flat if the workplace doesn't support the application of those newly acquired skills.
So you're saying training is not a one-and-done event.
Definitely not.
It's an ongoing process
It is.
that needs to be reinforced and supported by the organization.
Totally. Organizations need to create what they call a transfer climate, an environment that encourages and rewards the application of training, provides opportunities for practice, and offers that ongoing support and feedback.
That makes sense. It's like learning a new language. You might be able to conjugate verbs in the classroom, but if you never actually get a chance to speak the language, you're going to forget everything.
Exactly.
You need that real-world practice.
You do.
Okay.
And when it comes to creating that supportive environment for learning and development, the research really emphasizes the role of mentors.
Ah, mentors. Those wise and experienced guides who can help us navigate all the ups and downs of our careers. Everyone needs a good mentor.
Everyone does.
I feel very lucky to have had some great ones in my life.
And the sources dive into all the different types of mentoring relationships, the benefits and challenges, and the ingredients for successful mentoring programs.
Okay, I'm curious. What's the difference between like a coach and a mentor?
That's a great question. So coaching tends to be more focused on specific skills or goals,
Okay.
whereas mentoring takes a broader, more holistic approach to development.
Okay.
Mentors provide guidance, support, and advice, really based on their own experience, helping their mentees grow both professionally and personally.
So a coach helps you win the game, and a mentor helps you navigate life.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And the research shows that mentoring can have a significant impact on individual performance, career advancement, and overall job satisfaction.
It sounds like a win-win for everybody. But you mentioned that there are some challenges with mentoring programs.
Right. One of the biggest challenges
Yeah.
is making sure both the mentor and mentee have realistic expectations
Okay.
and are committed to the process. Mentoring relationships take time and effort and trust to develop.
So it's not just about pairing people up
No.
and hoping for the best.
Not at all.
Right.
Successful mentoring programs require careful planning, training for both mentors and mentees, ongoing support, and a clear understanding of the program's goals.
Okay, that makes sense. I feel like there's a theme emerging here. Whether we're talking about training or mentoring, it's all about creating that supportive environment that really fosters growth and development.
It is,
What?
and it all comes back to organizational culture,
Yeah.
a culture that values learning, development, and continuous improvement. That's where you're going to see individuals reaching their full potential.
Okay, I love that. Now, one of the sources talks about this resonance model, and it sounds like a very different approach to performance and potential.
It is.
Yeah.
The resonance model really challenges that traditional goal-oriented approach to performance.
Okay.
And it emphasizes aligning external goals with internal experience.
Okay. That sounds a little woo-woo. Can you break that down for me?
I know it might sound that way at first,
Yeah.
but it's actually very practical.
Okay.
So the idea is that when we're fully engaged in our work, when we're in that state of flow that athletes and artists often talk about, that's when we're performing at our best. And the resonance model suggests that this happens when our work is aligned with our values, passions, and sense of purpose.
Okay, so it's about finding that sweet spot where your work feels both meaningful and challenging.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the model actually outlines a process for achieving that state of resonance.
Yeah.
And it starts with identifying your experiential dream, the work that truly lights you up, and then creating a plan to align your actions and goals with that dream.
So it's like finding your work soulmate.
You could say
I
that.
love that.
And while the model isn't explicitly about mentoring, it definitely has some clear implications for mentoring relationships.
Okay, how so?
Well, traditional mentoring programs often focus on helping mentees achieve those external goals,
Yeah.
like promotions, raises, bigger titles.
Right.
But the resonance model suggests that mentors can play a really crucial role in helping their mentees actually discover their passions, align their work with those passions, and create a more fulfilling and resonant career journey.
Okay, so it's about nurturing the whole person, not just their career ambitions.
Exactly.
I love that.
Recognizing that true fulfillment comes from aligning our work with our deepest values and aspirations.
So it's not just about climbing the ladder, it's about making sure you're on the right ladder
Precisely.
in the first place.
And that takes a level of self-awareness and introspection that's not always encouraged in traditional work environments.
Right, that's a good point. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, but I think we need to address the elephant in the room again. Compensation.
Okay.
Does money really motivate people? And how can organizations design pay and reward systems that actually enhance performance rather than hinder it?
The eternal question, right?
Right. Does money buy happiness? Or at least
Yeah.
better performance?
Or at least better performance, right?
And, one of the sources actually dives into this question with some pretty surprising findings.
It does.
Yeah.
What I found really fascinating was that the research suggests that much like a lot of other things we've been talking about, the relationship between pay and motivation is complex
Okay.
and nuanced.
So the old adage that money talks
It's not always true.
isn't always true.
Not necessarily.
Okay, interesting.
In fact, some of the theories that they present in the source material actually challenge that conventional wisdom, that more money always equals better performance.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are these unconventional theories telling us?
So one really intriguing perspective comes from self-determination theory,
Okay. Yeah.
which we touched on earlier. It suggests that while those external rewards, like bonuses, can be motivating in the short term, they can actually undermine intrinsic motivation over time.
So if you're constantly dangling a carrot in front of someone, they might lose sight of the joy of the work itself.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And this is especially true for tasks that are inherently interesting or challenging.
Right. If someone's already passionate about their work,
Right.
they're finding it intrinsically rewarding, then a bonus might actually make them less motivated.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. So what's the solution? Do we just ditch performance-based pay altogether?
I don't think it's about ditching it entirely.
Okay.
It's about understanding when and how to use it effectively.
Okay.
And the research suggests that it's not necessarily about the money itself, but how it's framed and delivered.
So again, it's all about context.
It is.
Right.
If financial rewards are perceived as controlling or manipulative, they're very likely to backfire.
Right.
But if they're seen as a form of recognition or appreciation for a job well done, they can actually boost both motivation and performance.
So it's not just about the size of the paycheck, it's about the message behind it.
It is.
Right.
Another key insight from the research is that fairness is absolutely crucial.
Of course. No one wants to feel like they're being cheated or undervalued. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they highlight the importance of equity theory, which suggests that people are motivated to maintain a sense of fairness in their relationships with their employers.
Okay.
So if they perceive that their contributions are being fairly rewarded, they're more likely to be satisfied and motivated.
Right.
But if they feel like they're putting in more effort than their peers for the same rewards, or that their rewards aren't really commensurate with their contributions, they're going to start to disengage.
That makes sense. So is pay transparency key?
It can definitely help. But it's not just about transparency. It's about ensuring that your pay and reward systems are perceived as equitable and aligned with performance.
Okay, so it's about kind of ditching that. It's just business mentality.
Yeah.
And actually treating people like valued partners
Exactly.
in the organization.
And this ties back to that concept of the psychological contract,
Yeah.
that unspoken agreement between employees and their employers.
Right.
And when that contract is violated,
Yeah.
whether through unfair pay practices or broken promises, trust is eroded and performance suffers.
So it's about more than just those transactional exchanges. It's about building relationships based on mutual respect and trust.
Absolutely. And when it comes to designing pay and reward systems, I think the research suggests that organizations need to move beyond that narrow focus on financial incentives and consider a more holistic approach.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
It's about recognizing that people are motivated by a variety of factors, not just money.
Right, back to the million theories of motivation.
Exactly.
Okay, all right.
Some people are driven by recognition, others by opportunities for growth and development, still others by a sense of purpose and meaning in their work.
So tailor the rewards to the individual.
Exactly.
Right.
And that takes a deep understanding of your employees, their values, their aspirations.
This deep dive has been incredibly enlightening. We've gone from, defining performance to exploring the role of motivation, culture, even leadership. It feels like we've uncovered so many layers to this topic.
There are a lot of layers.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle that I'm really excited to explore. The concept of well-being. Can we actually perform at our best if we're stressed out, burnt out, or just generally unhappy? And what role do organizations play in supporting the well-being of their employees?
That's a crucial question, and one that's getting a lot more attention in the research these days.
Let's dive in.
Yeah, well-being, it's definitely a hot topic.
It is. It is. So we've talked about how important it is, but where do we even begin? It feels like such a big, complex topic.
It is a big topic, but the research does give us some good starting points.
Okay.
One of the sources highlights that connection between chronic stress and performance.
Right.
And it really suggests that organizations have a responsibility to identify and address workplace stressors.
Okay, that makes sense. But how can organizations actually go about identifying those stressors? Because it's not always obvious, is it?
It's not always obvious. It does require, sometimes digging a little deeper and really understanding the day-to-day experiences of your employees. So organizations can use different tools like surveys, focus groups, individual interviews to really get a sense of what's causing stress in the workplace.
So it's about going beyond that surface level and really listening to what people are actually experiencing.
Exactly.
Okay.
And once you understand the stressors, then you can start to think about strategies for addressing them.
Okay, so let's say an organization has identified some major stressors. What are some concrete steps they can take to create a more supportive environment?
Well, we've already talked about the importance of job design.
Yeah.
Giving people more autonomy and control over their work
Right.
can go a long way in reducing stress. Flexible work arrangements, where possible, can also be really helpful.
Right.
But beyond those more concrete things, it's also about creating a culture where people feel supported.
Okay, you keep coming back to culture,
Huh.
which makes sense.
Huh.
But what does that actually look like in terms of well-being? How can leaders cultivate a culture that truly supports employee well-being?
I think it starts with creating a culture where people feel comfortable talking about stress and burnout without fear of judgment or stigma.
Right.
It's about making sure employees know about the mental health resources that are available to them and encouraging them to actually use those resources without shame.
So it's about normalizing those conversations, about mental health and well-being.
Exactly. It's about creating a workplace where it's okay not to be okay.
I love that.
And leaders can play a huge role in this by modeling those behaviors themselves.
Right, leaders need to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Absolutely. When leaders prioritize their own well-being and they openly discuss their own struggles, it sends a really powerful message to their teams.
You know, one of the things that I find really inspiring about this whole conversation is that it feels like we're moving beyond that traditional like work-life balance paradigm and embracing something more holistic.
I think so too. The research is definitely pointing to this idea that it's not about separating work and life into these neat little boxes,
Yeah.
but it's about finding ways to integrate them
Yeah.
in a way that supports our overall well-being.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that work is a part of life.
Yeah.
And life is a part of work, and finding ways to make those two things work together harmoniously.
Exactly. And that's going to look different for everyone.
Right.
Some people, it might be flexible work hours so they can attend their kids' soccer games.
Yeah.
For others, it might mean having a dedicated space at home
Yeah.
where they can focus on work without distractions.
So it's about giving people the flexibility and autonomy to design their work lives in a way that supports their individual needs and preferences.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's about recognizing that when people feel supported and they have a sense of control over their lives, they're more likely to be engaged, productive, and happy.
This whole deep dive has been incredible. You know, we went from defining performance to exploring the role of motivation, culture, well-being, leadership. Like, we've uncovered so many layers to this topic.
We've covered a lot of ground.
And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that performance isn't just about individual effort or talent. It's about creating a supportive ecosystem where people can thrive.
I completely agree. It really is about the system.
So as you go about your work and your life, think about how you can contribute to creating a more positive, supportive, and thriving ecosystem for yourself and for those around you. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving to create a world where everyone can shine.